Good morning, everyone. This is Tom Schwed. I'm the chair of the Violence Prevention Partnership. Thank you for waking up somewhat early on this beautiful Wednesday morning to attend our policy team meeting. We have an action-packed agenda, so why don't we get started? First, I would like to welcome and thank our Vice Mayor, Natalie Rogers, for joining the Violence Prevention Partnership team. I believe this is your first meeting, Natalie. Is that accurate?
Yes.
We won't ask you to be doing anything. You just be the active participant you always are, but thank you for joining us this morning. And let's see, we have outside of that introduction, we have no other new members to report. And the only citywide update I'd like to share with everyone, you have a wonderful opportunity to spend this morning with Natalie and I. And if you'd like to spend this evening with us, on Thursday and Friday, we're doing our all-day city council goal setting. And at 5 o'clock today, we're taking public comment. So if anyone would like to make comments to the city council about what our priorities should be for the next 2 years, please join Natalie and I. We will be there starting at 5 o'clock. And with that, Mr. Carter, would you like to go to our violence prevention update?
Good morning, everyone. An evening with Tom and Natalie. Can it get any better than that? I think there's some fundraising opportunities. We're on to something. Since our last policy team meeting, the partnership spent the majority of January preparing for the kickoff of the revamped violence prevention awareness series, which is, as a reminder, a series of monthly events throughout the year, also formerly known as Gang Prevention Awareness Week and Gang Prevention Awareness Month. These events and trainings are now tied to predetermined themes throughout the year, such as equity development in January, parent engagement with 4Cs in February, recreations neighborhood services in March, and in April, we'll be having ACEs and child abuse month, for example. A component of the public outreach emphasis is also the launching of virtual interview sessions to share with the community your visions and input on civic engagement opportunities for young people, ideas on community-wide change while addressing systemic racism and inequities, and also just an overall snapshot of your organization's impact and resources for families. So all of you will be on the list eventually to be interviewed, but if you have any input on the framework before we launch it, please feel free to reach out to me. Also, a component of these strategies, it's also tied to the upcoming update of the Community Safety Scorecard in partnership with Upstream Investments, who also is our evaluation team for the Choice Cycle 10 evaluation through the results-based accountability framework. As the timeline is developed, the partnership and Upstream staff will be seeking your input again to inform what the enhanced scorecard will look like. But the early consensus is to ensure that it can easily communicate across multiple sectors and multiple levels, including electeds, administrators, direct service staff, community groups, but with a particular emphasis on the general public's interpretation of the new design. And so along the same lines of community health, it is my pleasure to introduce the infamous Lisa Whitkey Schaffner to provide the group with a brief update from Health Action.
Thank you very much. Nice to see all of you on Zoom. Can't wait for the day where we're back in that room there. But I just wanted to share, we had a Health Action meeting last week, and there's a couple of things, and I think I shared last time we met and got to pass on to Jason, to pass on to you all the information that we had. But this was very informative, especially in the Santa Rosa area. So the first speaker we had was from Caritas Village. And I know many of you are intimately involved in the project, but if you're not, they shared the scope of work with us, some partners that have already come on board to make sure that that is a successful project. And there's many of them. So we will get that out to you. And I felt like this is a project to be proud of downtown Santa Rosa. Secondly, I think that one of the things we did, and that really will be close and interesting for this group, is we are redesigning Health Action. And I think I've mentioned that before, to take that out of the county as a separate entity. What should that look like for an entity like that to be the kind of convener of health, income, and education in Sonoma County. And so we had a listening session, and everyone on the call, I think there was 85 people, shared what they think community led is. And I think that there's many faces on this call that we work on. What does community led truly mean to people? And so I think there was a lot of interesting input from that, and that's synthesized, and I will share that with you. And then the next piece was we had to have a conversation about the vaccine. So we had the county share their new Say Yes to the Vaccine project. And I just wanted to share that I have that slideshow in there, interesting work on how to share with people to get the vaccine and feel safe with it. And of course, thank you, Vince Harper. He shared the violence prevention seminar, the amazing seminar you did with the whole group. And so I think you have widespread viewing of that. So thank you for doing that for everyone in Health Action. So Jason, I think those were the highlights. I also wanted to, anyone that has not had a conversation, if you do work around the ACEs, the new ACEs Aware Network, Dan Sherman can share that with you from Center. He's with, of course, working on that, and he's the manager of community health. And so there's Petaluma Hospitals, Hillsburg Hospital, of course, our Santa Rosa St. Joseph's. And so get involved in that if you have not seen this grant that was just awarded to Sonoma County. So Jace, I think those are the highlights, but I will pass that on because the email is full of information. I think 5 attachments, but take a look into what makes sense to you and your organization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
Sure.
Any questions for Lisa?
Yeah.
I know she does an incredible job explaining everything and all of those attachments that she's referring to. Okay, so if there are no questions,
Great.
Thank you so much again, Lisa, for all the work that you do. Next, we will actually be moving the agenda a bit. Oh, actually, we do have Dr. Washington. She just logged on. So with that, we can continue. This was all planned for Dr. Washington to make a very dramatic appearance. So as referenced earlier, staff has been committing hours upon hours on the seminar that Lisa had referenced earlier. And we were extremely grateful to had an opportunity to partner with Dr. Sharon Washington to facilitate deconstructing race and racism with over 360 in attendance. If you were not able to catch it live, please visit our website in order to view the recording and also take the short survey to assist in the partnership shaping of future conversations and various initiatives and trainings and events. That is also in alignment with some of the early survey responses. We asked for 3 strategies in creating an unbiased community, and the top 3 rated answers were education, training, and awareness so far. So the partnership definitely set the bar high with starting off the calendar year with Dr. Sharon Washington. And we have received comments through the survey such as, quote, really phenomenal. This was so well designed as a presentation, provided excellent background information and so much room for reflection. I will have to listen again, as we all have multiple times in this room, I know. As well as another quote, I realize how ongoing this work is. It is never ending. The challenge is how to keep it going. Applause to the partnership. The applause is definitely extended to this particular group and all of our community-based organizations, and especially to Dr. Sharon Washington, who facilitated a 3-hour slot that somehow kept everyone on the edges of their seats the entire time, all while creating an extremely safe space to really envision what change looks like here locally in Santa Rosa and Sonoma County. And Dr. Washington has graciously agreed to come back today to provide a quick summary of some of the key aspects that were discussed in the seminar in order to continue the conversations here in our community. And so with that, we have about 30 minutes with Dr. Washington. And I'd like to turn it over to her now. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Thank you all for having me. So I am going to share some slides on my screen and just sort of guide you through, as Jason mentioned, a little bit of a sort of revisit of some of the key aspects of the seminar, but really from the vantage point of my understanding of you all is that you have positions that contribute to leadership, the agency to cultivate change in various ways within the community. And so from that lens, I just sort of want to guide you through a very quick conversation, an orientation to this work. So I'll describe some sort of structural drivers of inequities and talk about unintended racism a little bit, really sort of focus on the impact of racial trauma, and then provide some key behaviors of anti-racism and allyship and accompliceship. So that's a lot for a few minutes. So I'll do my best and I'll probably talk fast. So I think fundamentally just sort of recognizing the deep and vast foundation of racism and the infrastructure of our governance and the systems that we rely on as a society being birthed and born through the lens of racism and chattel slavery, forced land, extraction from indigenous people. And so really, rather than sort of separating ourselves from something that feels historical and different, honoring that that is the foundation that we stand upon and build upon new policies each day. Also recognizing the deep connection between racism and socioeconomic status, poverty, and how we experience the implications of hundreds of years of forced free labor for an entire group of people, and how just because slavery was emancipated, that doesn't eliminate the sort of foundation of poverty that racism is predicated on. And so we can see that in current day wealth disparities, where you can see that in their 30s, whites have an average of $147,000 more in wealth than blacks, or 3 times more wealth in their 30s. And then we see that by their 60s, whites have $1.1 million more than blacks. And that is because of a foundation of multiple generations where black folks were not only not allowed to enter into the free market workforce that was developing under capitalism, but that their labor was like the foundation for creating an economic system that was so abundant, because that labor was free and you could breed more of these African people to produce free labor to then benefit a small group of people. And those people transferred land, businesses, houses, and that's what people who are identified as white have access to inheriting. And then between 1963 and 2016, families in the 10th percentile, the most poor families, low-income families in the country, went from having zero wealth to having $1,000 worth of debt. When you consider how much of that 10th percentile is concentrated in communities of color because of the legacy of racism, you can appreciate the disparities in poverty that we have there. In the families with the middle income more than doubled their wealth within that time. And then we see the people with more and more wealth exponentially grew that wealth, only, vastly increasing the disparities in wealth and the implications that has on entire communities. When we think about how wealth is accumulated through home ownership, property ownership, etc., how systematically for most of the generations that people have lived on this land, Black people in particular have been disallowed from living in the suburbs as they were developed so that middle class status could be grown exponentially for people identified as white, as well as those white folks who had served in the military and were eligible for the GI Bill. And so I also want to focus on the laws, again, thinking about how you all have agency around policies and practices and norms, whether within your organizations or through the city. The role of laws in enforcing racial group inequities is so important because people made these laws. Human beings, just like us, with your titles, made these laws, right? Made these policies in the local level, in the state level, in the federal level. And it will be people like us who undo those laws, who create laws that really deeply, actively, what is that you do with the garden where you're like, you know, you got to pull things from the roots. You know, we really have to extract the roots of racism from our policies, practices, and norms, and not just engage people in trainings and hope that their knowledge is going to make racism go away, because racism is embedded into our systems and not just our minds. And that is dated back further than the 1705 Virginia Slave Code, because we already were enslaving African people since 1619 or so. But in 1705, before this country had even been formed in its own governance and independent identity, laws were put in place to regulate and justify the killing, particularly of Black and brown bodies. And so the Virginia Slave Code said that all servants brought into this country who weren't Christians in their original country would be slaves. So that could include the European indentured servants, who were, you know, a good number of the initial settlers here. But all Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves with this dominion shall be held as real estate. And so separating the experiences of indentured servitude among white folks from the lifelong intergenerational servitude of enslavement that Black and brown people were susceptible, but largely people of African descent were over generations really held and limited to. And so that if a slave should resist their master, correcting that slave, correcting them for committing a crime or for what is accused as a crime, should a Black, Indigenous, or person of color be killed in this correction, the master shall be free of all punishment as if such accident never happened. And so this is why to this day we have to say Black Lives Matter, because it was codified into law hundreds of years ago that they don't matter, right? Because they are the property of white folks who own them. And should those lives be taken for whatever reason, you have an entire framework of legality that makes it okay and will never bring it back up. And so it's so important that we deeply recognize the ways in which all of our policies, practices, and systems were birthed to benefit a specific group of people at the expense of another group of people. And this hierarchy of oppression has grown and become more nuanced over time. But what we really have to embrace is, how do we as individuals leverage the agency we have within organizations, within city government, within state, national platforms, to look for the deep-seated elements of racism in our policies, practices, and norms, and weed those things out, and then create through inclusive, you know, best practices for amplifying the voices of marginalized communities and allowing Black and Indigenous people to lead our solutions. Can we then instill in some fresh soil and some fertilized with equity and education opportunities to have a rich and vibrant, diverse, and equitable future? And keeping in context that the vast majority of this like history that seems far removed has been not just the baseline long time ago foundation of our society, but the vast majority of the time that Indigenous people have shared this space with those who colonized from Europe, as well as long as African people have been on this land with those same, you know, European ancestors, the vast majority of that time has been spent fighting off enslavement and being enslaved, second-class citizenship under Jim Crow, where we didn't have access to quality education, didn't have access to healthcare and healthcare systems or settings. And then post the Jim Crow era and civil rights, there was a couple of years before the war on drugs really, you know, took and AIDS, you know, HIV and AIDS really assaulted what was left of the Black community post the structural violence that came upon Black folks advocating for civil rights, like the assassination of so many civil rights and Black power leaders. They didn't just die of heart attacks, you know, they were killed trying to create equity. And so really honoring the deep-seated trauma of entire communities who have been consistently, historically, for hundreds of years asking, like, please get the knee off of our necks. And so then we are currently talking about health disparities as like stress and, you know, perceptions of discrimination. Yes, you can measure the outcomes of oppression in those sort of body symptoms and my high blood pressure and my, you know, depression, but that is just such the tip of the iceberg of the foundations that have built untimely death, morbidity, mortality for Black and brown people because of racism, not because of the melanin, but because of the racism. And so thinking about, you know, it isn't organic to human beings for the white human beings to like oppress the brown human beings. We are taught, we are socialized into practices and norms that are harmful to marginalized people, and we aren't taught how to undo that and how to stop doing that. We also aren't taught or allowed up until very recently in our history to even talk about racism, religion, that's implicated in the constructs of racism, money and the inequities with that, sex and sexuality, or politics. And so when we are socialized to not talk about these core aspects of where and how our inequities have been formed, how are we going to come to solutions? And all of that can really drive, especially for members of the dominant group, unintentional blindness or inattentional blindness. And so this picture is from a study that shows how 83% of radiologists who were asked to scan this image of human lungs for cancer nodes did not see that there's a massive gorilla inside these lungs. And like, how could that be? Are we concerned about radiologists and their training in America? No, the issue is that when people are focused on something, it's very easy to not see very visible stuff all around you. So if you're white and you've spent your entire life being trained as a physician or political science, and so now you're leading this part of city government and you're focused on that and like thriving in that, all these microaggressions and racism that nobody ever taught you about, that nobody's ever named for you, that you've never had to experience yourself, it's happening all around you and you just don't see it because you're thriving at what you're skilled at. And that's not anything bad about your character, it's inattentional blindness. And it also is a function of our unconscious biases. And so when we have unconscious biases that are universal, that we all have, but then we also are socialized through our media, our textbooks, the segregation of our neighborhoods to have racial stereotypes and assumptions about groups and people and spaces, it produces and promotes unintentional racism. And so unintended racism can look like microaggressions, these like attempts to connect with people or make jokes or inquire that's, not racially literate and it's offensive. And it seems really small, but for people of color who deal with it on the bus, in the coffee shop, at work, and also get paid less, and also, are more likely to have higher levels of stress that produce, heart disease. And then the healthcare system treats us with bias and we're more likely to die in it. So the microaggressions are called micro, but they are a part of macro implications for Black and Brown people. And so it's so important to really prioritize exploring within ourselves how we are leveraging micro, assaults and behaviors to produce macro implications for our Black and Brown team members and peers. And so those micro exposures, coupled with witnessing Black and Brown people getting killed in our news feeds, community traumas that we're experiencing because our communities are, under-resourced, it produces meaningful biological implications for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so that's relevant for the communities that you serve and that you lead, but it's also relevant for the Black and Brown people on this call and that work on your team and that are supervisors or direct reports. Because although, we're in the workforce, we also are Black and Brown in the world experiencing these traumas, and in the workplace where people are not necessarily assessing for pay inequities or, workload inequities where Black and Brown people and women may be doing more work but getting paid less and not getting, promotions. And so the actual health implications is something that you all as leaders, as allies, and as accomplices should really grow in seeking to disrupt, because there's no reason that because an employee is Black or Brown that they should have to carry, even the biological implications of these kinds of trauma and stress. And so we understand that racial trauma and the manifestations of it actually align directly with the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and that the psychopathology of trauma among rape victims is actually very similar to that of victims of racism, because it directly affects the personhood and the core identity and humanity of that individual. And so for people of color, even beginning from preconception, where you're coming from a womb that has been concentrated in trauma and discrimination, who also came from a womb that was a generation of trauma and discrimination, that intergenerational trauma is this broad foundation upon which our immune systems, our, Chemical reactions to stress in our body are elevated because of the legacy that we've inherited and how that shows up in our family dynamics and community. And then the actual interpersonal bias that we interact with that triggers and traumatizes us. Therefore, anti-racism is really what we need in order to uproot the racism that's ingrained in our policies, practices, and norms, and in our unconscious biases and subtle behaviors. And so anti-racism moves away from just thinking that if I get along with everybody, then I'm not racist, and instead accepts that if you are socialized in a white supremacist society where all of the governing systems of our society have been rooted in racism, you're socialized to perpetuate racism unless you actively work to know how to not do that. And that's what anti-racism allows us to do and challenges us to do. And not only uproot the racism in our own thoughts and processes, but in the practices, norms, and policies of your organization, and facilitate the redistribution of power, decision-making, access, and agency for BIPOC folks to be included and centered in, the next generation of how our society governs ourselves. And so some actions of an ally include to learn, learn your own biases, learn your history, learn the history of others, learn about the interactions of your identity groups with people of other identity groups. Look for your own blind spots. Increase your mindfulness and question your gut reactions. If you haven't actively engaged in racial literacy development, you should hyper scrutinize your gut reactions when it has to do with, racially diverse anything. Because our gut reactions have not been cultivated with a conscious complexity and nuance to how people of different races experience the world. It just hasn't. Interrupt and report bias when you see it. Let go of the notion that if I'm a good person, then I'm not racist, because only bad people are racist. In fact, we all are socialized into it, and we all are implicated, and we all have to be a part of the solution. Really reflect on whiteness and your proximity to it, or the way in which you've leveraged it to benefit so that you could be where you are in your life. Reflect on your fragility and how you respond in agitated ways in racially contentious opportunities. Reflect on your marginalized identities and how those come into play as you try to grow as an ally and as a leader in anti-racism. And then receive education and input and feedback from people of diverse perspectives. And I just want to wrap up by challenging that although I'm sort of focusing on allyship, you all, with those of agency and decision making and access to power that you have, really should be invited to challenge yourselves and your peers to grow into accomplishship. And so accomplishship is where you shift from sort of focusing on what are my behaviors and how do I interrupt bias? How do I make sure that I'm mitigating my own biases as an individual person, to how do I leverage the positionality that I have through my work, through my social status in this community, to change policies, to change norms and practices and structures. And so because of, the power within this particular group, I also want to invite you to think about the actions of an accomplice. So disrupting, and these are just a few examples, disrupting the use of, let's say, race-based medicine when you are working in hospital settings, or in research, or in, if you're not collecting data on race and ethnicity as it pertains to the utilization of social services through your agency, you're missing the potential for race-based gaps and inequities. Understanding, knowledge of patients in healthcare settings in particular, but of your community members, making sure that your community members are educated about race and racial literacy so that they too have the language to advocate for their needs as much as you're developing your ability to meet them. Think about and undo institutional inequities. Don't be out here educating the community about anti-racism, but you haven't changed the pay inequities that are disproportionately leaving your Black women being paid less than your white men or your white women for doing the same thing or for doing more. Divest from systems of inequity that drive harm towards communities, like privatized prisons, like mass incarceration, period. And if you don't know what that means, like, research that, look into that. Create systems of accountability for things like microaggressions, where you've got women of color and Black women who have their hair touched and groped in the workplace by people who don't know them. But the harassment policies don't address that, because harassment is an individual over time doing, consistent and persistent problematic things. But what if it's just a random stranger offering a compliment and then violating your body? There's no policy for that. So really focusing on accountability within institutional policies, practices, and norms to reduce bias, but also to increase racial literacy and require that. If people are going to be leading diverse teams, they should be versed in diversity, right? So some questions to leave you with. Have you ever considered and consciously reflected on allyship and decided to committing to be an ally? Or is it a word that like people use and you're like, yeah, I'm that because I don't hate anybody. But have you really explored what is expected of you as an ally and embrace that that's what you want to do in your personal life and your professional life? Do you believe that allyship and accompliceship is requisite to your job? Or do you think that it depends on a person's personal beliefs and that shouldn't be, put on the table for debate at work? Which behaviors of an ally make you uncomfortable when you think about having to step up, not taking breaks, behaviors that demonstrate consistent commitment to equity, even when it's hard? What about that are you maybe less ready for? And does your workplace promote and facilitate allyship and accompliceship for leaders through your policies, practices, and norms? Or do you put out statements, but then your policies, practices, and norms go pretty much untouched? So with that, I'm not exactly sure where we're at with time, but I would love to see if folks have any thoughts, questions, how that lands for you, what you take from that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Washington. There continues to be an extraordinary amount of work ahead of us here in Santa Rosa. Before we open it up to questions from the group, I do just want to share my own personal opinion. The Santa Rosa Police Department has put forward an incredible intentionality with changing the systemic inequities towards equality here in Santa Rosa. That being said, what recommendations do you have for law enforcement entities specifically that are authentically committed to change, but no matter what the attempt, some groups will link a local police department or a local probation department to nationwide tragedies and inequities?
So, okay. One observation that I've had in some of the major cities where I've done work and activism is that when communities come together, even to extensive lengths to get as many agents of change and contribution to community wellness and equity to the table to talk about rethinking our response to drugs, right? And like decriminalizing and instead having a humanistic approach to policies that include law enforcement, but are also reflective in inequities and disparities. Oftentimes the group that won't show up to the dialogue is law enforcement. And so if within this hypothetical, you're saying in a specific locality, law enforcement is showing up to every community dialogue. Law enforcement is committing to changing their internal policies, practices, and norms to, require that people check for bias before they pull someone over. They are using body cams. They're using all of the best practices that reflect genuine, integrated anti-racism. One, if that were really happening, like I haven't seen a law enforcement agency genuinely sort of look at every aspect of their culture, policies, and practices and apply an anti-racist lens. So I would say if law enforcement really wants to show that they are about it and they don't want to be compared to like national, incidents, then make sure that within their institution, they have assessed for inequities for gender and race and other forms of marginalized status in their pay, in their hiring, in their recruitment, in their diversity and equity on all levels, including the highest levels of leadership. Because if this same like local, hey, we're different from everybody else, has a few people of color on the front lines and no people of color in the leadership, you're not that different. No offense, but you're not. You're not different enough for 2020 and moving forward. Because it's not just about how the community perceives you because you haven't shot anyone in a crisis situation. It's about, are you shifting the culture of law enforcement by deeply disrupting and uprooting the racism in your own department, in your policies, practices, norms, hiring, diversity, inclusion, community engagement, and then going back on a state and national level and showing other agencies, this is what we're doing, this is how it works, this is how we're disrupting the culture of law enforcement that we were trained into and embedding anti-racism into it, and this is why you should do it too. So if you're just sitting there local, like not shooting anybody and not wanting anybody to look at you when other people shoot somebody, then you've got to do the deep-seated institutional change work and then be an accomplice and advocate for other departments to do the same thing, because you don't want anyone in your state feeling scared and unsafe about the police in that department. Don't just sit there being glad or hopeful that nobody feels scared about you. You know what I mean?
Thank you, Dr. Washington. With that, I'll open it up to the group. Any questions?
I have a private question I'll respond to real quick. It's a question about the use of the term BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, and why is that, and why can't Black folks just be called Black folks, and why do we have to be lumped in with like other people of color? And I think that BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, emerged out of sort of people growing in the use of the term people of color, or POCs. And part of the concern about using POCs is that as we're engaging in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and more spaces are inviting dialogue about diversity, equity, and inclusion, most spaces that are majority white led, because that's what most spaces in America are more comfortable with talking about diversity of gender, diversity of sexual orientation, diversity of physical and cognitive ability, because in part white people are in that. White people are queer, white people have disabilities, white people are women and non-binary. And so the leaders of these predominantly white spaces are implicated in the victimhood of those themes and issues. When we talk about race, in most predominantly white spaces, like when we think about the power dynamics and the agency to change structural oppression and to own the manifestations of white supremacy, white people get named and implicated in a way that's less comfortable and people are less accustomed to. And so the use of POCs creates this kind of umbrella where it gets easy to sort of hide anti-Black racism, because you can just talk about diversity and inclusion and representation of people of color. Well, Chinese people have a different sort of socioeconomic and cultural experience within America than Samoans, than do Black people, than, you know what I mean? And so the glossiness and the unclarity of POC was problematic, especially for Black folks and Indigenous folks whose legacy of racism and structural violence is markedly distinct from these groups of color who have immigrated here and experienced racism. The people who were stolen from Africa and their descendants, and the people who are from here who were mass murdered for us to take up their land, those experiences are markedly different, and people wanted to have Black and Indigenous distinctly named so that we're not muddied in POCs and then ignored. And those who carry the most disproportionate burden of racism, Black and Indigenous people, are going unnamed. So that's why BIPOC emerged. And for some Black folks, it's like, even with that, can we please talk about anti-Black racism? Because even with using BIPOC, it still becomes easy to talk about like racism loosely, but not name the ways in which light-skinned Latino people can have a very different institutional navigating experience than like dark-skinned Black people. And being able to have the space to really call that out is important. So I thank you for highlighting that.
Any other questions for Dr. Washington?
Jason, oh, sorry.
Vice Mayor? You're on mute.
Not a question, it's a comment. Just as far as what you were talking about earlier with our law enforcement, I think that it's a difference when leadership within an organization is attempting to make change, but when you don't have everyone on board that is under that leadership, then you start to have a problem. And so for me, I think that is what we may be seeing in Santa Rosa, is that leadership is saying all the right things and doing what they need to do in order to push to see change. But when you don't see everyone under that leadership going in the direction of the leadership, then we tend to have a problem.
Mhm.
So I think that's something that we're facing right now.
So it sounds like in most institutions, you've got these hierarchies. You've got like the senior leadership, and then you've got like, you know, middle management and like supervisors and whatnot. And then you've got like frontline staff. And there's different nuances to that. But in general, there's like layers to this. So if your core leadership is like, yes, we get it. We really care about this. This is a commitment. We'll put money into it. Then I would suggest a very focused effort on educating those middle manager people, getting their not just buy-in, like, you know, this is important, can you like agree with us, but like, this is an expectation now for your job description. You know what I mean? You got to institutionalize that into your expectations for your management. And then if you are charging them with like, y'all need to go through this boot camp, you need to be racially literate, this is what we're expecting of you as far as your behaviors. One, I think that if you charge and like concentrate education in your management, you can equip them, even with some coaching, you can then equip them to manage the dissemination of these values to the front line. And if some of those managers don't want to, that's the value of this free market economy. Like, that's what you're supposed to do. If you can't align with the values that we're evolving into to promote equity, then you can be employed somewhere else. But I find that focusing, like disseminating that commitment from the top to a very focused very focused educational effort among your management will then be pivotal to getting strong leaders who can then help disseminate the values and the education to the front line. There are a couple of questions in the chat, if it's okay if I address them. One's, would you consider the rejection of people who have criminal records for employment in civil service jobs a type of racial ethnic discrimination? Yes, I would. And I say that because the history of disproportionate and targeted race-based policing of communities of color, specifically through the war on drugs, is one that not only do we continue to see how many unjust arrests and policies are wrapped up with, you know, if we had a 100-to-1 disparity in crack from coke and people are still locked up from that, like, we know now that's not fair, but we haven't changed the policies and let all those people out and expunge their records. You got, you know, largely white folks who can make millions and now into billions on marijuana, but you still got Black and brown folks from the inner cities sitting in jails and prisons over marijuana from the 90s. And so fundamentally, the process of incarcerating disproportionately Black and brown people was built with racism. And until we cleanse that and expunge a lot of the unfair, unequitable, inappropriate labels that have been placed on members of Black and brown communities, to then use that to keep people from jobs, where they have experience and insight that's actually important for the communities affected by those jobs, it is perpetuating an inherited cycle of oppression that perpetuates race-based inequities. So yes, I absolutely agree that that's a form of racism. Until you cleanse the legacy of race-based policing through the war on drugs and absolve people who are still sitting in jail unfairly, you know, prison unfairly, and have those unfair, structurally inequitable labels attached to them, once we expunge all that and we start fresh and brand new, then you could think about if there's a reason to vet people out based on fair policing, but we've never had that. Can you please talk about the approach many institutions are taking to hire a single person of color to address equity issues versus having equity be everyone's business? Do you have any guidance, or can you give guidance on the best approach? So I think that some groups' responses have been like, we need to hire a person of color because 2020 is letting us know that without having that, we're racist. And sometimes the best way to kill two birds with one stone is like, let's commit to diversity and we'll hire a brown person. And now we've got diversity and a brown person. And that's problematic in a lot of ways. Oftentimes we're socialized not to be able to respond respectfully to the leadership and the voice of people of color, particularly women of color in the workplace. So then you hire basically a token person of color to fill a token slot for diversity and inclusion, but are you really committed to like listening to that person and doing what they say so that you can eliminate the racism in your institution? So I think that creating a committed educational approach for your leadership so that everybody who's making decisions about your organization is racially literate. Everybody should be racially literate, and we're not because of our educational system and our societal white supremacy. But if you want to commit to that, you need to fundamentally make sure everybody's educated enough to be racially literate. And then everybody is contributing racially literate and conscious ideas to every aspect of your work. Are there any live questions? Because there are still more in the chat, and I also want to be thoughtful of your time. I know you have other things to explore.
I did have one question, Dr. Washington.
Yeah.
You really struck me. I like the slide that you had about the lung and not seeing the gorilla in there. And it kind of reflected back after I took the 3-hour training, which I really enjoyed. Processing the information, especially your social identity profile, you got to start with yourself. So as I'm self-reflecting, well, 30 minutes later, I'm in another meeting and we're off doing something else. So for an organization with an interest of doing that change, how do you find the time and prioritize the time to do this work on each individual employee basis? The city of Santa Rosa is an employer of 1,200 people. Any suggestions how we prioritize that with the other demands of a municipal city of our size?
Yeah. So one is you have to root yourself in your why. Why is this important to you? Not because it's trending in the national news, but because you have recognized through data and statistics and your appreciation of the historical context of your city that without addressing these issues, you are perpetuating racial inequities that you inherited. And if you don't want to, then ground yourself in that why and have a North Star that directs you as to like, why are we doing this? What are we doing this for? When are we going to know that we're being successful? So if you are grounded in that, then I would suggest, identifying aspects of your current meeting schedule. You've got team meetings, you've got all staff meetings, you've got in medicine, they've got grand rounds. What are the opportunities where everyone comes together? That's one place where you could look at integrating, whether it's one of those sessions per month, the whole session is to explore our racism in ourselves, our policies and practices. Or the intro is a reflection question on racism for every meeting. However you might integrate it into where do you already come together with your ideas and with your collective vision for your organization and embed it in that, then there's the educational component because you all have good hearts and you bring your good hearts, but if you don't have knowledge, you can't produce meaningful, sustainable solutions. So really looking at ways that you can integrate learning into people's workday, carving out time for people to grow in some training, but then you also have to allow people to debrief in various ways. And so I think knowing why you're doing it can give you the muscles to commit to creating the time and integrating this into all aspects of what you do and not just finding little pockets where you can touch on it.
Great, thank you.
I see a question. Is it okay if I take another question, Jason, or are we on
Sure.
time? Okay. Looking at the national events and as military and law enforcement participation in the riots at the Capitol is being revealed, how do we, brown and Black people, know that our local law enforcement does not have employees that participate in the Oath Keepers, 3 Percenters, Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys, Patriot Prayer? Okay. How do we know? Thank you for asking that question. I honestly think that is a kind of question that Black and brown citizens of every city think about, are scared about in our daily lives. And also a body of information that, one, lots of Black and brown people were hip to and aware of, whether we knew the statistics or not, and that the federal government has been aware of. There have been reports about the infiltration of law enforcement by white supremacy group members for years. So one aspect of authentically addressing this very volatile and sensitive question is honoring that we've been knowing that this is a problem. We've also, those of us who are grounded in history, understand the historical origins of law enforcement as it relates to slavery and the policing, regulating, capturing, and maintaining of Black and brown bodies. Until we reckon with the connection of law enforcement to the state-sanctioned utility of regulating Black and brown bodies, we can't have a genuine and authentic conversation about trust between law enforcement and communities. The same is true in healthcare, where we've got legacies of abuse and mistreatment and jacked up experiments on Black and brown people. And until doctors and the medical establishment own that and educate themselves and create mechanisms to be very clear about how they're moving away from that history and how we are protected from those practices, we can't just trust y'all. You know what I mean? So I think that having law enforcement community participate in these dialogues, own the racism within the underpinnings and the roots of the practice of law enforcement, and then very actively be able to display, this is what we're doing to trace back the roots of racism in our practice, in our culture, in our policies that are formal and informal, and this is what we're doing to earn the trust of Black and brown people. We're not just asking for it. We're not just expecting it. We're not just assuming you should give it because we put ourselves at risk. If you're Black and you walk out in these streets, you put yourself at risk. And that just is how it is. And so I think that until law enforcement reckons with that past and then is transparent about it, brings it to the table and says, this is the work we've been doing to uproot the racism in our ways and our origins. Community, what is your input about that? What do you need so that we can help facilitate collective healing and not just expect that the community constantly gives us this trust and respect and authority that is rooted in our oppression and hasn't been reckoned with.
Thank you so much, Dr. Washington. What the partnership staff will be doing, we'll be collecting the data from the survey, along with consolidating some of the themes that were talked about at the seminar and here today, and then pushing that out to the public in order to inform some of the future dialogues that we want to participate in. We're also excited to hear that you'll be working with Sonoma County Probation. You'll also be working with the Social Advocates for Youth Board of Directors. So we're excited to have multiple conversations throughout the community with the conversations surrounding equity development. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your energy and insight, and we look forward to the outcomes that are in front of us. And I know together, Santa Rosa, Sonoma County will continue to move the needle in this direction. So we appreciate you. Thank you so much. And with that, Councilmember Schwedhelm.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Washington. She also mentioned it on her training that if you do want to follow her on Instagram, she's got some great information and great quotes in there that you just get those little nuggets of information that are really good. And I think her Instagram is Dr. Sharon Washington. So anyway, with that, we're going to move on to the rest of our agenda in the final 5 to 10 minutes that we have here today. So for our scorecard, crime and safety, Chief Navarro, are you still here? I know Captain Cregan's there. Chief Navarro, there you are.
Yes, I am. Thank you. I'm gonna, I would love to have some time maybe in the future to maybe talk a little bit more about some of the things that, some of the questions that were directed to Dr. Washington, because I think there's going to be, it sounds like there's a lot of questions about local law enforcement, but I'll save that for the future. We are doing a lot of things. Just a couple quick things on what Dr. Washington said. We have a grant we have 3 grants, one on cultural diversity, one on community policing, and one on racial profiling and implicit bias that we're going to be working on this year. And then we're also working with the SEED Collaborative with the city. So we're really excited about that. And those are things that we take very seriously throughout our organization. We're working on a mental health response model. As you may know, we just went into contract. Captain Cregan has done a lot of work in that particular area. And we should be having a team up and running sometime by the end of the summer. So we're really excited about that, hoping for a new way of responding to mental health calls. And then Dan Marinzik is here, and he probably give you just a few quick numbers of some of the local issues that we've had in the last couple of weeks. Dan?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name's Dan Marensic. I'm a lieutenant. I'm in charge of our investigations team, our bureau at Santa Rosa. So I just wanted to give a couple of numbers related to some criminal statistics and some things that we've seen over the course of 2020. I think one of the biggest things being how has 2020 kind of impacted crime and safety in the city of Santa Rosa. So we do have some of those numbers. Some of the things that we have seen is that significant criminal activities such as aggravated assaults, which we classify as felonies, those have increased over this year. So just to throw some numbers at you, we had 664 reported aggravated assaults in Santa Rosa. That's a 14% increase from 2019. Looking at shootings, we had 61 shootings in the city of Santa Rosa last year, and that's a 49% increase from the year prior. So we've definitely seen an increase in some of these more serious or significant type of activities in the city of Santa Rosa. And to kind of compare that with what we've seen over the last week, you know, for those of you who get our Nixle alerts or read the Press Democrat or the local news, there's been a significant activity in Santa Rosa over the last week. So we've had 2 shootings, a robbery involving a firearm, and just in this last week, we've taken 5 firearms off the street, which have culminated in several arrests. So it has been pretty busy. Obviously, you know, 2020 numbers are significantly higher in those aspects as opposed to 2019. And so far with 2021, we're still seeing that increase in some of these more significant crimes, but we'll see how kind of the rest of 2021 pans out. So that's all I really have on just a brief update on some of the numbers. I know we're short on time, but if anybody has any questions about anything specific, I'd be happy to answer them or try to answer them.
Any questions for Lieutenant Marinsic? Not seeing any. Probation or Public Defender's Office, anything you'd like to share with the group? Go ahead, Kathleen. Oh, you're on mute, Kathleen.
I was wondering, of those assaults, how many of them were domestic violence related and having to do with shelter in place? Or have you segregated those?
Yeah, we haven't segregated them. So looking at the numbers from last year, we had 757 reported incidents of domestic violence. So that's an increase of roughly 10%. I mean, I think we can definitely say there's a correlation between an increase of domestic violence and shelter in place. Whether it's the causation or not, I don't know, but there's definitely been a correlation and an increase of domestic violence over the last year.
Well, I can assure you, if I were shelter in place and not coming to work and home with my husband all week, I would probably have some domestic violence calls.
Thank you, Tom.
Go ahead.
Try and interject something beyond that. In probation, we're very excited about our work with Dr. Washington. We initiated a contract with her about 2 months ago and have launched our work mostly with the management team here, not just senior management, but management across the department. And so around racial equity and leadership development in that arena. And so we're engaging with her and we'll be very shortly putting out to staff the opportunity to have a one-on-one with her to discuss what their impressions are about the organization, their work in the organization, to address and get at some of those areas that she was talking about. So that's going on. We've had an increase a bit in the female population in juvenile hall and on supervision. A couple incidents that you folks are aware of, I think intervened in. And then also a lot of attention being paid to, you may have read about the realignment of juvenile justice, the Division of Juvenile Justice. So as of July 1, any youth who previously would have been sent to Division of Juvenile Justice will be managed locally. And so we have a subcommittee formed. Judge Ganos is on it, the public defender, DEA, SCO, a number of community providers, human services, health, and developing a plan to deliver services to those youth who will be housed locally, and it'll be the full continuum of services available to them. So we can update you on that as we get closer to that implementation date. And I think that's about it. Larry, anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to add the Elevate Justice Act. It's going to raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction to a youth's 20th birthday to give 18 and 19-year-olds the benefits of rehabilitation, mental health, and counseling services. So that's going to be a real exciting difference in, the population that we serve. We're focusing a lot on the rehabilitation, the community reentry and transition. And so working with a lot of local community-based organizations. As I tell everyone, I said, we're really blessed in Sonoma County to be rife with a number of organizations who are absolute experts in serving our most at-risk youth.
And real quickly, a footnote on the Elevate Justice Act that is waiting to be introduced in the legislature. So it's not something that's going to take effect immediately. It has to work its way through the legislature.
I appreciate that, Dave. And if you do want some support for that from the partnership or from the city of Santa Rosa, please send me some information. We can see if there are some ways that we could support that. Yvette, I see you have your hand up. Question?
Yes, this question and a comment, more so a comment. As each and every one of you are moving forward with the different work that you have at hand, it's very important that we bring in the community as a whole. So as you're doing this work, make sure you're figuring out ways to get the information to the public, the ones that don't come to these type of meetings, the ones that don't have the ability to use the technology like the rest of us. So I commend you all on the work that you're doing, but we still have a lot of work to do here in Santa Rosa. And as you're moving forward, again, reach back to those entities, reach back to the students, reach back to, the people that don't have the access. They need to know what's going on in our city, because then that will start breaking down some of the barriers we have here in our city, and that people see that there's really real change happening here in Santa Rosa.
Thank you for that, Yvette. Any, Monica?
Hold on, I'm on Zoom. Sorry, my 7-year-old just walked in. I have a question for Dan on the increase, the 49% on the shootings. Do you have any more information on that? I mean, here we are shelter in place, but the shootings go up. So that's not domestic violence, I don't think, correct? Do we have less officers out in the streets, or I was just curious about more information on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of the specific shootings, obviously each situation or each incident is going to be different. All the shootings are not domestic violence related. They're separated in different categories. So those shootings can range from things and involve a domestic violence incident, or it can also involve a gang related incident. It can involve just a fight between people that kind of culminates and results in a shooting. So it's it's a separate category. In terms of the staffing issues, staffing is an issue that we have run up against, of properly staffing and putting the proper number of officers out on the streets to deal with this stuff. So, I mean, that's an issue that we face and will be facing in the future too. So, then, I don't know if there's a question regarding the specific shooting incidents or not, but all I can really say is they're not the same as the domestic violence related incidents, and it kind of culminates to a whole bunch of different things that just result in a shooting. So there's different circumstances behind each one.
And I guess that's what I was inquiring about. What are those, specifics, the stats, and I guess I don't want to take up too much time talking about it because I see that some people have to go with the time. But I was just curious what areas, just the statistics on it, like where and who.
We could probably
I
get
can
some.
talk about it another time.
Yeah, we could probably come up with some better statistics on the actual gun violence. If we can do some research and get back to the policy team. And I'll talk to Jason about that. Maybe for the next policy team meeting, see if we can get some better, groups of what they are.
Great.
Okay, thank you, you too.
Thanks, Chief, for that information. I think that would be helpful to share. Anything else on crime and safety? Not seeing any. Rolling on to economic conditions. Anyone have got an update in that category, that domain? Not seeing anything flying through here. Family and community connectedness. Any update for that? And finally, our final domain, schools. Are there any updates coming from the school?
Am I the only one from schools?
It
appears that way.
So I know we had seen some earlier, but go ahead, Dr. Harrington, if there's something you'd like to share with us.
Well, first of all, people are comparing the state California Department of Public Health standard for reopening schools to the CDC standard. You can't do that. The algorithms for CDC are different than the algorithms used by the California Department of Public Health, which causes some confusion to the general public. Knowing that, the California Department of Public Health standard is the one all school districts are developing their COVID safety plans for. And remember that on January the 14th, a new set of rules came out for schools, which gave them more flexibility, but they had to write new plans. And so that's what they're busy doing, writing new plans. And they have to conform with Cal OSHA plan as well as a CDPH. So most of our school districts will be submitting plans in the next week or so. They have to be, because we're still a purple county, they have to be approved by the local county health officer before they go to the state. That's a slowdown for us because we're in purple. If we were in red, like Marin, which is going to yellow or orange, or Napa, we wouldn't have to go through those extra steps. So people keep comparing us back and forth, but they need to know that we've never been a red county. We've never been both Napa and Mendocino and Marin have all been red counties. And once you open, you get to stay open. But we've never been at that status. But we will be there. We anticipate we'll be there within the next 2 weeks. And schools should look at some form of reopening. It will start out as a hybrid model in the elementary grades first. That's where we are. And currently we're running a vaccination clinic for 17,000 school employees. So we're trying to get everything done at the same time. That's a sort of an overview of schools.
Can I just ask a quick question of Dr. Harrington? So just so I'm understanding right, the plans that have been put in place already several months ago are now different and the schools are submitting new plans. Is that correct?
They aren't necessarily different. They have to adapt their old plan to the new format and answer some additional questions with the new standards that have been done. Originally, the school was only going to be open when it was 7 cases per 100,000. Now they flexed it so you could open at 25 cases per 100,000, and you can bring back full grade levels, which was never in the original first plan. So now they have to modify it to say how they're bringing back a full grade level at a time and what that would look like and how they'll manage. And then remember, if you're Santa Rosa City, you have multiple school sites. So you have to develop a comprehensive plan, and then you have to do a school site specific plan. So Petaluma, Santa Rosa, Windsor, they have multiple school sites. So they have to do a general plan with site specific plans that follow.
Okay, thank you. After school providers are hanging on every word, waiting to see how we're gonna serve families. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Yvette, you have a question?
Yes, it's just in relation to the numbers that we currently have for COVID. And I know there was some, a little discrepancies. Have that been all worked out as far as the discrepancies are and pertaining to when we can go back to school? I know you mentioned they was trying to increase that, but the numbers overall for the county, does anybody know any updates about that as well?
I can tell you the current case count's about 17 per 100. I haven't looked at it today, but it was the other day or so. So it's coming down rapidly, which is good. And we have an equity factor for social equity factor for our case count, which the federal government doesn't use, which means we could be red by March. So that would mean all this extra step that they're currently going through would be eliminated. They would just submit it directly to the state.
Thank you for that, Dr. Harrington. Yes, our goal is let's get to red. Let's get to red. Any other questions or comments regarding school reports? Okay. Are there any members of the public who'd like to make public comment? Not seeing any. Okay. Just want to remind everyone our next policy team meeting is on April 21st. April 21st. Let's predict we will at least be in the red for Sonoma County by April. I appreciate Dr. Harrington saying, or let's do it in March. That's a great goal. Okay. And then we did public comment. Jason, any final comments?
I do. Thank you, Tom. On February 28th, a local tragedy occurred when we lost Carlos Del Pozo too soon. He was a father, a husband, a community leader, and friend to many. Choice has funded Padres Unidos since 2006. He was a regular participant in the operational team on the MDART team, and many of you have participated in the Carlos Del Pozole night to raise funds for families in Roseland. Just to end the meeting, I do encourage you to please take a moment to appreciate others, recognize the smaller things, and celebrate Carlos's impact in our community. And that's it for me, Tom.
Thank you so much, Jason. Yes, the Pozzoli nights. Learned a lot of new skills there, right next to Mr. Oliveras on many of those. All right. Thank you for all your attendance. If we don't see you before, we will see you April 21st. Thank you for participating. Have a great week.